for this sermon series by an article called The Essence of Jerkitude. And I've confessed I didn't know there was such a word, and found the article interesting as this person described who qualifies to be considered a jerk. Well, I actually heard someone use the word in a newscast this week. I was listening to the radio, and maybe you heard about the pay it forward phenomenon at a Starbucks in St. Petersburg, Florida this past week. You know how the person who buys their drink says, I want to pay for the one that's coming up, and then the one that comes up says, oh, somebody paid for mine, I'll pay for the... This lasted 10 hours, and it covered 458 people before someone out of town said, I don't care what they think of me, I'm not paying for the person in back. But during that string of pay it forward, they interviewed a man who said, I really don't want to do it, even though the person ahead of me paid for mine, but I don't want to be considered a jerk. I said, ooh, my sermon series is all the way down to St. Petersburg, Florida. The jerk, you'll remember, is a particular form of sinner. Another one of the ways we fall short of the glory of God. And the description has gone this way. A jerk is someone who believes they're better than everyone else, doesn't need to listen to anyone else because they know it all, believes they're in a position to tell all the ignorant souls what they need to know, believes they're in a position of being right all the time and therefore can judge or criticize everyone else. And because they often feel they are better, they feel they deserve whatever privilege or advantage they can exact from all the peons and all the underlings beneath them. And so they do. They manipulate, they control, they take advantage, all the while feeling that because they are superior, they have a right to treat others that way. This morning, we're looking at another jerk in the Bible. And as I look at the relationship of the jerk to everyone else, the jerk jerks. The jerk feels that he has a right to do to others as he wants to do to them, not as they deserve, except in his own mind, not respectfully, not as a fellow human being. Pharaoh, you'll remember, jerked the Israelites over and over and over again. You remember the story? Joseph, his brothers, their father ended up in Egypt, where they had gone during a famine. And they stayed there long enough to grow, proliferate. They became so numerous that a Pharaoh eventually felt threatened by the numbers of these foreigners within his borders. And so he addressed his fear a couple of ways. One was to issue an edict of infanticide. All the male Israelite babies were to be put to death by the midwives, but the midwives obeyed God rather than Pharaoh, and so the babies lived, especially one baby whose name was Moses. And you remember how he was raised by Pharaoh's daughter and grew up, eventually had to flee to his uncle Jethro's because in defense of one of his own, he killed an Egyptian. The word got out, and he had to leave. Minding his own business one day, you remember, God speaks to him through a burning bush and says, Moses, you're the one I've picked to go to Pharaoh and tell Pharaoh to let my people go because he's working them to death. That was the second way that Pharaoh decided to oppress and contain this growing population within his borders, try to kill the male children and then work the older Israelites to death on his construction projects. The people cried out, God heard their cry, sent Moses to Pharaoh, and one after another, God sent a plague, you remember? Pharaoh would have enough of the plague and say, get out of here. And then when they left, he realized that his cheap labor was gone, and he'd go after them. And that brings us to the last plague this morning. Reading from Exodus. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. Pharaoh arose in the night, he and all his officials, and all the Egyptians, and there was a loud cry in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. Then he summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, rise up, go away from my people, both you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord, as you said, and take your flocks and your herds, as you said, and be gone, and bring a blessing on me too. And then, when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the minds of Pharaoh and his officials were changed toward the people, and they said, what have we done, letting Israel leave our service? So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 picked chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them, and pursued the Israelites. And you know how the pursuit led to the Red Sea, and you know the rest of the story. The experience that I want to lift up is that experience of living with unpredictability, or unpredictability being predictable. It's that on and off, back and forth, go, no, come back. Go, no, come back. It's that living jerked around constantly by someone who has the ability to do it. If you've ever lived with or known someone who has lived with someone under the influence of a substance, an alcoholic, an addict, you know what life is like living with such a person. On, off, good, bad, safe, afraid. And you live in the middle of that. This morning, I want us to think about the antidote to that kind of relationship. And I'm calling it the virtue of constancy. The virtue of constancy. You call it trustworthiness, call it fidelity, call it faithfulness, call it reliability, dependability. It's that confidence that this particular person can be counted on. And now I'm talking about constancy in goodness and righteousness. There are those who exhibit a constancy that isn't of goodness and righteousness. You can count on them to be critical. You can count on them to be a naysayer. Whatever your idea is, you know they're going to shoot it down. You just count on it. You just know. That's not the kind of constancy I'm talking about. I'm talking about constancy in goodness and righteousness. You and I are who we are today because there have been those persons in our lives who had the virtue of constancy. When life was coming apart, when we were going down for the third time, they were there. It just occurred to me that one of the most common affirmations of a person's life that I hear when I meet with family members preparing for a service of death or resurrection, when someone wants to give thanks for a mother or a father or a sibling or a friend, what do they say? He, she was always there for me. Constancy. We thrive when we have those kinds of persons in our lives. When I was thinking about a person in the Bible that exhibited this virtue of constancy, you know who came to mind? I don't know who comes to your mind. The woman who came to my mind said this. You can tell me who it is that's speaking. Pop quiz this morning. Entreat me. This is from the King James because it's beautiful. It's the way I heard it. It's the way some of you heard it when you were younger. It's poetic. It's powerful. Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. I had to go back to a Bible I was given when I was a boy. I looked at the front, 1962, King James Version. Had to hunt for a King James Version. Entreat me not to leave thee or to return from following after thee. For whither thou goest, I will go. And where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me. Is there a more beautiful expression of constancy than that kind of commitment to fidelity? All right, extra credit this morning. Who said it? Ruth, to whom? Naomi, her mother-in-law. It is an expression often quoted in wedding ceremonies, but originally it was spoken by a daughter-in-law to her mother-in-law. And you know the story. Again, famine caused Naomi and her husband Elimelech to take their two sons to Moab where there was food. And while they were there, the two sons married who was available, two Moabite, two foreign girls. And then Elimelech dies and the two sons die. And Naomi tells her daughter-in-laws, I have no more sons to give you. You stay here, marry husbands of your own people. I'm going back to Judah, back to my people. The other daughter-in-law whose name was not the well-known TV Oprah, but Orpah. The other daughter-in-law was Orpah, not Oprah, but Orpah. Same letters, just arranged differently. She ended up staying. But Ruth said to Naomi what I read. No, where you go, I'm going. Constancy. You can count on me. I'm not leaving you. And you know the story. She goes, they're poor, and in that time, the welfare system was called gleaning. Persons who had grain fields would leave some of it for the poor to come after the main harvest and gather grain. And she was told by her mother-in-law, go to Boaz's field. And from a distance, Boaz took a liking to Ruth, told his workers to leave extra grain so it would be easy for her to glean, fell in love with her, and married her. And you know the rest of the story. Boaz and Ruth had a son whose name was Obed, who had a son whose name was Jesse, who had a bunch of sons, but the youngest one was little David, who became king of Israel, from whose line descended, in the city of David, Jesus. Constancy, the virtue of constancy. You can count on me, Ruth. But listen to the story. God, Yahweh God, the Lord God. Faithfulness, fidelity, constancy. Constancy in goodness, constancy in righteousness. I think it goes all the way back to college. I remember a New Testament course hearing, I think I remember this right, that the Greek word translated righteous was also the word used to describe a plowshare that cut straight furrows. A righteous person is one whose life cut straight according to the will of God. Okay? That's the kind of constancy. Those persons that when we go to, we know we can count on them to not be blown by circumstances, to not be fickle, to not act on whim, but kind of sort through, separate the wheat from the chaff, not make mountains out of molehills, be able to discern the difference between eternal treasure, treasure in heaven from costume jewelry, you know, that treasure where moth and rust corrupt and thieves break through and stuff. Those who are tuned to the will and the wisdom of God. This church, in my experience of it, is so blessed to have persons in abundance who possess the virtue of constancy in goodness and righteousness. You. And part of that constancy in goodness and righteousness consists of a kind of anonymity in the exercise and the practice of it. You all don't know what Bucky and I and others kind of in the inner workings of the church know. about the leaders of our congregation. Some of them this past year could have quit their day job and spent all their time on various concerns and issues and needs that this congregation has had. And they've done that despite what's been going on in their own lives. But they've been constant in their faithfulness to God's will, which for them has been faithful to this congregation. I think of Paul Stum. Later today, we're having a church council meeting. I think of Paul. Think of Brownie Vantry's Finance Committee, Candy Mallory, trustees, Ken Kleinerd, columbarium. We're going to have a columbarium here before long. Jody Auld, Staff Parish Committee, Eddie Callis, Endowment. This church has thrived because there have been those who, in their own quiet way, have been constant in goodness and living out the will of God. The church has been able to depend on them, count on them. The church needs such people, and this church is so blessed with them. And so does business, and so does the government, and so does public service. I think this is Bob Hamilton's last week as a judge. I've heard Bob when I was doing Leadership Wilson a couple of years ago. One of our stops was Bob's courtroom, and we heard Bob talk about how he saw what he did as a judge being a way he expressed his faith. And everything I've heard about Bob is that he has used a judgment of constancy in goodness and righteousness to go about doing what he has done. I think of Philip Craighead and have watched Philip lead this city in a similar way. So many obstacles that his plow could have hit, and there's that constancy there. I think of all of you who teach day in and day out, who work in the medical field, or who take care of children with special needs, or just children. All children have special needs, some more than others. Who care for the sick, the disabled, who care for those who are aging and in the last part of their life. I think of you, and how many of you exhibit the virtue of constancy, and I give God thanks for you. Now, as I describe that virtue and give thanks for you, I have to confess that I know I'm not always as constant in goodness and righteousness as I want to be. I blow it. I get angry. I say things I wish I hadn't said. I see things that don't register, or hear things that I don't pay heed to, and later say, "Why? How did I miss that? Why didn't I do this or that?" Constancy, the virtue of constancy, doesn't mean we're perfect. It doesn't mean we're not going to mess up. It doesn't mean we're not going to blow it. It doesn't mean we're stop being a sinner. Part of the constancy that allows us to be as faithful and as constant as we can be is the constancy of God in Jesus, who says to us, "You are forgiven." The constancy of God is mercy. Our faith is in a merciful God who says to you and me, "My grace is sufficient for you." Not your perfection, not your getting it right all the time, not your never messing up, not Not even you're never being a jerk. All of us have a little jerk in us, some more than others. The constancy that matters is the love and the compassion and the mercy and forgiveness of God. And if there was any doubt, Jesus hung on the cross and said, this is how much God loves you. And no, you're included in the prayer. Father, forgive them. Forgive them, for they don't know